He returned to the exact spot where she disappeared 32 years earlier. Not in the middle of the night, not in secret, not when darkness could hide his presence. He walked there in broad daylight on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in the middle of spring, when the world was coming alive again, when flowers were beginning to bloom and the air was beginning to warm, and someone was watching. Security cameras at the nearby parking lot captured every step he took, every pause he made, every single moment he stood there looking at the ground beneath his feet. For 32 years, he had walked free. 32 years. That is a lifetime. That is enough time for a child to be born and grow into an adult. That is enough time for the world to change completely. That is enough time to build an entire life, to hold down jobs, to maintain relationships, to move through the world as though you are a normal person. And all that time, he was carrying the weight of his secret. He was living a lie every single day. Nobody suspected him. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody understood that he was carrying the weight of a murder, that he was living a double life, that he had taken another human being's life and hidden it so completely that the world had almost forgotten her. Almost, but not entirely. Her family never forgot. Her mother woke up every morning thinking about her daughter. Her father drove through the neighborhood sometimes, looking at the streets where she had disappeared, trying to understand what had happened. But for 32 years, nobody could prove anything. Nobody could connect David to the crime. The evidence was not there. The witness testimony was not there. The motive was not clear enough. And so he continued to live, free from legal consequence, but not free from the weight of what he had done. But on that Tuesday afternoon in March, something changed. Something broke inside of him. Something that had been holding together for 3 decades finally fractured, and it pulled him back to the place where everything had gone wrong. He returned to the crime scene, under guard, under supervision, but he returned there nonetheless. What happened in those moments on the security footage would change everything the detective investigating the case thought he understood about guilt, about conscience, about the human capacity to carry unbearable truths, and about the ways that the mind rebels against the things we have done. By the time you finish watching this story, you will understand why a man who had escaped justice would willingly walk toward his own prison. You will understand the power of a memory that refuses to let you go, no matter how hard you try to leave it behind. You will understand how a crime that happened over 3 decades ago continues to ripple through lives, through families, through the person who committed it, and through the detective who refused to let it fade into the darkness. You will understand that justice does not always come quickly, and sometimes it does not come at all. But when it does come, it comes in ways that nobody could have predicted. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The case we're about to explore has haunted one family for more than 3 decades. It has consumed the professional life of one detective who refused to accept that some cases are meant to remain unsolved. It has challenged the way law enforcement understands the psychology of criminals and the way we think about justice in a system that often fails the people who need it most. It has raised profound questions about human nature, about conscience, about remorse, and about the ways that terrible actions continue to have consequences long after they have been committed. The central mystery is simple on the surface, but becomes impossibly complicated the deeper you look into it. On September 14, 1992, a woman disappeared from the quiet suburban streets of what we'll call Riverside, a middle-class neighborhood in the heartland of America, where everyone knew their neighbors, and nobody locked their doors at night. She was 34 years old, employed, respected in her community, and beloved by her family. She had plans for that evening, a dinner with friends that she would never attend. She had dreams for her future that would remain forever unfulfilled. The neighborhood where she lived was the kind of place where children played unsupervised in the streets, where neighbors borrowed sugar from each other, where people felt safe walking at night. It was 1992, and this neighborhood represented the kind of America that many people believed in, the kind of community where terrible things did not happen, where violence was something that happened somewhere else, to someone else, in some other place far removed from the quiet streets, where real people lived their ordinary lives. But terrible things do happen in these places. Evil does not announce itself. Danger does not come wearing a sign that warns of its approach. And on that particular Tuesday evening, danger came to Riverside in the form of a person who lived there, who was known there, who was trusted there. Before she vanished, something happened that created the first of many questions we will explore. The question that everyone asked was simple. The question that the police asked was simple. The question that her family asked was simple. Who took her life that night? Who is responsible for her disappearance? Who murdered her? But the real question, the one that haunted the detective who would eventually reopen this case, was far more complicated. Why would the man who had successfully disappeared for 32 years, who had evaded justice for 3 decades, who had managed to live a normal life while carrying the weight of a terrible crime, why would he suddenly return to the place where he had committed the greatest crime of his existence? Why would he risk his freedom? Why would he risk his safety? Why would he risk everything by returning to that location? What compelled him to go back? Was it remorse finally catching up with him after all those years? Was it guilt so overwhelming that it demanded to be confronted? Was it the conscience that he had apparently suppressed finally asserting itself? Was it something else entirely, something we might not fully understand? These are the questions that drove the investigation. These are the questions that drove the detective's obsession. These are the questions that drove the family's desperate search for answers. And the answers, when they finally came, would not be simple. The answers would not provide the kind of closure that people hope for when they are searching for truth. Instead, the answers would raise even more profound questions about the nature of human consciousness, about the capacity for guilt, and about the ways that terrible actions ripple forward through time. The woman who disappeared was named Rachel. Rachel Marie, to be exact. She grew up in a home where she was loved unconditionally, where her parents invested everything they had into her education and her future. Her father was a factory worker, a man with calloused hands and a quiet dignity about him. He understood the value of hard work. He had worked his entire adult life, had shown up to his job day after day, and had provided for his family. He was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he was intelligent in the ways that matter. He understood people. He understood responsibility. He understood that love meant showing up, meant working hard, meant making sacrifices. Rachel's mother was a nurse. She had dedicated her life to taking care of other people, to helping those who were suffering, to showing up for people even when it was difficult, even when it was emotional, even when it would have been easier to look away. Rachel grew up watching her parents work hard. She watched her mother come home from shifts at the hospital emotionally exhausted, but still making sure her children had everything they needed. She watched her father go to the factory day after day, year after year, and come home tired, but satisfied that he had provided. She understood from an early age that life required effort, that good things did not come without work, that you had to show up for the people you loved, that sacrifice was not something to resent, but something to embrace. She was the kind of person who made other people feel better about themselves just by being around her, not in the desperate, people-pleasing way that some people have, not in the way where someone is trying too hard to be liked. She was authentic. She was genuine. She cared about people in ways that felt real. Colleagues at her office remember her as someone who brought homemade cookies to share with the team, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who asked genuine questions about people's lives and actually listened to the answers. Not listening while planning what you would say next, but actually listening, being present with the person, making them feel like what they were saying mattered. She was the kind of person who looked at people and saw them, really saw them, not just the surface presentation but the person underneath. In photographs from the years before she disappeared, you can see a woman who was genuinely happy. Not the forced happiness you sometimes see in old photographs, not the artificial smile people paste on for the camera, but the kind of authentic contentment that comes from a life well lived, from knowing that you matter to people, from understanding that your presence in the world makes a difference. She had graduated from college with a degree in education and worked as a middle school teacher. She taught mathematics to 7th and 8th graders, which meant she spent her days with young people who were going through difficult transitions in their lives. These are the years when childhood is ending and adolescence is beginning, when everything feels dramatic and important, when peer relationships seem to matter more than anything else, when self-doubt begins to creep in, when young people are trying to figure out who they are and where they belong. By all accounts, she was exceptional at this work. She was not just good at teaching mathematics, she was good at teaching young people. Former students remembered her decades later as the teacher who believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves. There were students in her classes who struggled with mathematics, who thought they could not do it, who had convinced themselves that they were not smart enough, that they did not have the ability to understand abstract concepts and complex problems. Rachel would work with these students. She would sit with them one-on-one. She would break down concepts into smaller pieces. She would explain things in multiple ways until something clicked. She would tell them that they could do it, and she would not give up on them even when they had given up on themselves. She would stay after school sometimes just to help a student who was struggling. She would make phone calls to parents to explain that their child was doing better, that their child had finally understood a concept that had been confusing. Multiple former students said in interviews that Rachel had changed their lives, that she had shown them that they were capable of more than they believed. She had shown them that learning was not punishment but opportunity. She had shown them that adults could care about them in genuine ways, without wanting anything in return except to see them succeed. She had shown them that their potential mattered. She had a boyfriend named Michael, a decent man who worked as an accountant at a local firm. Michael was the kind of man who was reliable and steady. He was not particularly exciting or dramatic. He was not the kind of person who would make a grand gesture or do something daring just for the sake of it. But he was kind, and he was faithful, and he showed up for the people he loved. He loved Rachel deeply. He made plans with her. He imagined a future with her. They talked about getting married, about buying a house somewhere in the suburbs where they could start a family, about the life they would build together. Michael was not wealthy, and Rachel was not wealthy, but together they were building something. They were building a partnership. They were building a future. They were building the kind of ordinary life that most people hope for. He would bring flowers to her apartment sometimes, just because he wanted to see her smile. He would cook dinner for her on Friday nights when they were both tired from work. He would listen to her talk about her day, about the students she was teaching, about the challenges and the triumphs, about which students had finally understood something they had been struggling with, about which families were going through difficult times. He was the kind of partner that everyone deserves to have. There was nothing extraordinary about Rachel's life in the way that the world usually measures such things. She was not famous, not wealthy, not particularly influential in any grand sense. She was not going to change the world or become someone that history would remember. She was just a person trying to live a good life, trying to do good work, trying to love and be loved in return. She was ordinary in all the best ways. She was the kind of person who made the world slightly better just by existing in it. But she was loved, and she mattered to people, and that matters more than anything else. That is the most important thing that any of us can say about ourselves. The man who would eventually be identified as her killer was someone she knew. His name was David. David had a last name, and he had a life, and he had a family, but we do not need to focus on those details for now. What matters is understanding how a person becomes capable of committing a terrible crime. David moved through the world in a way that made people trust him. He was employed steadily and consistently, in a job that positioned him as someone in a role of minor authority. He worked at a location where Rachel sometimes went for business purposes. Maybe they saw each other in passing. Maybe they had a few brief interactions. Maybe Rachel had no idea how much David thought about her. He was not dramatically handsome or unusual in appearance. He did not fit the stereotype of what a predator looks like. He did not have strange eyes or a creepy demeanor or anything that would immediately signal danger. This is something that comes up repeatedly when people who knew him are interviewed about the case. They say he seemed normal. They describe him as quiet, somewhat reserved, not the kind of person who would naturally make friends, not someone who was outgoing or charismatic, but also not the kind of person who alarmed anyone. He was the kind of person you might see every day and not particularly notice. He was the kind of person who blended into the background. He was invisible in the way that many people are invisible. He had a family. He had a mother and a father who loved him. They had hopes for him when he was born. They had dreams about what he might become. They raised him the way they knew how to raise him. They provided for him. They worked to give him opportunities. And later, after everything happened, after the arrest and the conviction, they would struggle forever with the question of where they had gone wrong in raising him. Parents always do this. They always blame themselves. They always wonder what they could have done differently. But the truth is that some things are not the result of parenting. Some things are the result of choices that a person makes. Some things come from the darkness that exists inside some people. And no amount of good parenting, no amount of love, no amount of trying to do the right thing can prevent that darkness from existing. He had a place in the community, nothing spectacular. He was not a leader. He was not someone that people looked up to. But he was known, and he was accepted. He had a job where people relied on him. He had an apartment where he lived alone. He had a life that, on the surface, appeared to be perfectly normal and unremarkable. If you had looked at him in 1992, if you had profiled him and asked whether he seemed like someone who might commit a terrible crime, you probably would have said no. He did not fit the profile. He did not seem dangerous. He seemed like anyone else. What nobody knew was that David was carrying something with him every single day. He was carrying thoughts and impulses that terrified him, that he knew were wrong, that he had been told his entire life were wrong, but that had taken root in his mind and would not leave him alone. From an early age, David had experienced attraction and desires that made him uncomfortable. He had felt impulses that he understood were not normal, that society condemned, that he was told repeatedly were wrong and sick and perverted. Instead of seeking help, instead of talking to a therapist or a trusted person about what he was experiencing, instead of trying to address these feelings in a healthy way, David had internalized the shame. He had kept it hidden. He had built walls around it. He had tried to ignore it and hope that it would go away, but it did not go away. Instead, it festered. It grew. It metastasized like a cancer. It became more and more consuming. It took up more and more of his mental energy. It occupied his thoughts more and more frequently. He began to develop what we would now call obsessive thought patterns. He would become fixated on a person, and that fixation would take over his life. He would think about that person constantly. He would dream about that person. He would construct elaborate fantasies in his mind. He would imagine scenarios that involved that person. He would imagine himself in relationships with that person. He would imagine scenarios that became increasingly extreme and increasingly detached from reality. As time went on, the line between fantasy and reality became blurred. He would imagine something so many times, in such detail, that it began to feel real to him. It began to feel like it had actually happened. It began to feel like the person had actually reciprocated his feelings, had actually wanted to be with him, had actually welcomed his attention. David became obsessed with Rachel, not in the dramatic way that obsession is sometimes portrayed in movies, not in the way where someone is obviously unhinged and everyone can see it, not in the way where someone is openly stalking someone and everyone notices. His obsession was quiet, it was hidden, it was private. It was the kind of obsession that takes over a life from the inside, that nobody on the outside can see. He would find reasons to be near her, to see her, to exist in proximity to her. If he knew she was going to be at a location, he would make sure he was there too. If he knew her schedule, he would arrange his life to intersect with hers. He would construct elaborate fantasies about her in his mind, scenarios that existed only in his imagination, but that felt increasingly real to him. He would imagine that she felt the same way about him. He would imagine that deep down, she wanted to be with him, but she was holding back because of social conventions, or because she was afraid, or because she did not understand what she was feeling. He would tell himself stories about how she would eventually recognize his feelings, about how she would come to understand that they were meant to be together. He told himself stories about who she was and what she wanted, stories that had no connection to reality, but that justified, in his mind, the intensity of his focus on her. He began to believe that the reason she had not yet reciprocated his feelings was not because she was rejecting him, but because she did not understand them yet. He began to believe that if he could just get her alone, if he could just explain his feelings, if he could just be with her, in an intimate way, she would understand. And understanding, he believed, would lead to love. This is the kind of magical thinking that sometimes happens when someone's grip on reality has weakened, when fantasy and reality have begun to merge. The detective we'll call Robert entered the police force when he was 26 years old. He had grown up watching his father work in law enforcement, and he had inherited from his father a belief that order matters, that justice matters, and that the people who hurt others should be held accountable for what they had done. Robert's father had been a patrol officer, a man who spent his career dealing with the worst of human behavior. He would come home from his shifts and talk to his son about the cases he had worked, about the people he had arrested, about the situations he had responded to. He did not shield his son from the reality of the world. He did not pretend that everything was fine and that everyone was good. He showed his son that there was evil in the world, that there were people who chose to hurt others, and that the role of law enforcement was to stand between those evil people and the innocent people who were trying to live their lives in peace. Robert's father had instilled in him the belief that law enforcement was not just a job but a calling, not just a career, but a moral responsibility. It was something that you did because you believed it mattered, because you believed that you could make a difference, because you believed that standing up for people who could not stand up for themselves was important. Robert took these lessons seriously. He went to college and studied criminal justice. He worked small jobs before joining the police force. He prepared himself mentally for the work he knew he wanted to do. He understood that this work would sometimes be frustrating, that there would be cases he could not solve, that there would be people he could not help. But he also understood that the effort mattered, that the trying mattered, that the refusal to give up mattered. When he entered the police force, he brought with him this sense of purpose. Robert was not interested in personal glory or advancement or recognition. He was not trying to become a high-ranking officer, or to become famous, or to get his name in the newspapers. He was interested in justice. He was interested in solving cases. He was interested in helping people who had been hurt. He was interested in holding accountable people who had committed crimes. He was the kind of law enforcement professional who became obsessed with facts and evidence and timelines. He was the kind of person who would stay at the police station until midnight reviewing case files, who would drive past locations multiple times trying to understand exactly what had happened, who would go home and continue thinking about cases long after his shift had ended. He would dream about cases sometimes. He would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about a detail he had forgotten. He would call other detectives from home to ask about something they had found. His colleagues respected him but sometimes found him frustrating. He had high standards for himself and for everyone around him. He believed that the work of law enforcement required precision and dedication, and an unwillingness to accept easy answers or obvious conclusions. He believed that when someone had been hurt, when someone had been killed, that person deserved to have someone fighting for them, fighting for the truth about what had happened. When Rachel disappeared, Robert was not the lead detective on the case initially. That responsibility went to others, officers who had seniority and who were assigned the case as a matter of protocol. But something about the case stuck with Robert. He began to follow it, even though it was not his case. He would read the reports that came out. He would attend briefings when possible. He would talk to the other detectives about what they had learned. And something about the case gnawed at him. Something did not feel right. Something suggested to him that the obvious conclusions were not correct. The case went cold. Days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of Rachel. Weeks turned into months, and the case was no longer fresh. Months turned into years, and the case became what law enforcement calls a cold case. A case where leads have dried up, where evidence has not been found, where it is unclear whether a solution will ever be possible. Years passed, and the case remained unsolved. Suspects were investigated and cleared. Tips came in and led nowhere. The trail went completely cold, and eventually, the case was filed away, essentially abandoned by law enforcement because there was no evidence pointing clearly to anyone, and the leads had all dried up. The detectives moved on to other cases. They had new cases to work, new victims who needed their attention, new crimes that needed to be solved. Rachel's case became a file in an archive, a name on a list of unsolved cases, a memory that faded as time passed. Most people would have let it go. Most detectives would have moved on. The case did not have the kind of evidence that suggested it could be solved. The trail was too cold. The leads were too thin. The evidence was insufficient. But Robert could not let it go. He would pull the file out during his free time and review it again. He would read the same reports he had read 100 times before. He would look at the same evidence that had been examined repeatedly. He would drive through the neighborhood where she had disappeared and try to imagine what had happened on that night. He would put himself in Rachel's shoes. He would put himself in the shoes of the killer. He would try to understand the timeline, the opportunity, the motive. He developed a belief that the person who had taken Rachel was still out there, still alive, still walking around free. He believed this with a certainty that bordered on obsession. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. His superiors suggested he should move on to cases that had a reasonable chance of being solved. His family sometimes expressed frustration that he was spending so much time on a case that was not assigned to him, that was not part of his official responsibilities. But Robert could not let it go. He had made a commitment to Rachel, even though he would never meet her, that he would not abandon her case. He had made a commitment that he would keep searching for the truth, no matter how long it took. Years passed. Robert continued his career. He worked on other cases. He solved some of them, he failed to solve some of them. But Rachel's case never left his mind. It was always there, in the back of his mind, a mystery that demanded to be solved. Robert was not the kind of detective who accepted unsolved cases as inevitable. Robert was the kind of detective who believed that every case could be solved, that every victim deserved justice, that every mystery had an answer, if you looked hard enough and believed hard enough. September 14th, 1992, was a Tuesday evening. Rachel had finished her classes at the school where she taught. The students had packed up their backpacks and headed to their next classes or home for the day. The building had emptied out gradually as the afternoon progressed. Rachel had gathered her things. She had organized her classroom. She had prepared materials for the next day's lessons. She had made sure that everything was ready for when she returned to that room the next morning. She lived alone in an apartment, a modest place that was her refuge, where she could read and listen to music and be alone with her thoughts. That evening, she had plans to meet friends for dinner. It was a regular occurrence, something she did once every week or two. She met friends from high school, people she had known for most of her life, people she was close to. They had stayed in touch after graduation. They had maintained their friendship through the years. She never missed these dinners unless she was sick, and she was not sick on that Tuesday evening. She was looking forward to the dinner. She was in a good mood. She had survived another week of teaching, of managing a classroom full of teenagers, of grading papers and preparing lessons and trying to reach students who were struggling. She was tired, as teachers always are after a full week, but it was the kind of good tiredness that comes from doing work that matters. The evening was clear and cool, the kind of late summer evening that made you believe that fall was coming. The days were getting a little bit shorter, the nights were getting a little bit longer. The air had a crispness to it that suggested that the season was changing. It was a beautiful evening, the kind of evening that makes you glad to be alive. What happened between the time she left the school and the time she should have arrived at the restaurant is something that exists now only in the realm of speculation and theory, and the reconstructed memories of the man who was eventually identified as her killer. The exact sequence of events, the exact words that were spoken, the exact moments when Rachel understood that she was in danger. We cannot know these things with absolute certainty. We know what David eventually admitted to. We know what the evidence suggests. We know what happened based on the confession and the investigation. But there are details that will forever be known only by the people who were there. David had positioned himself to encounter her, not by accident, but through careful planning. He had thought about this. He had planned this. He had worked out the logistics of how he would approach her, where he would do it, how he would make it happen. He knew her schedule. He knew when she would be leaving the school. He knew the route she typically took to get where she was going. He had thought about this moment many times, perhaps hundreds of times, in his mind. He had imagined this encounter countless times in his fantasies, and on that evening, he decided to act. He decided that the time for imagining was over, that the time for actually doing something had arrived. What his reasoning was, what had finally pushed him to cross the line from fantasy to action, what had finally convinced him that it was time to take this step, remains something that even he has never fully explained. Perhaps he believed that if he could be close to her, if he could be with her, she would understand what he felt. Perhaps he had convinced himself that his feelings were mutual, that she would welcome his attention if he could only explain it to her properly. Perhaps he had deteriorated to the point where the line between reality and his fantasy world had become so blurred that he could not distinguish between the two. Perhaps something happened that day, some small rejection or some perceived slight that finally pushed him over the edge. What we know is that he approached her. What we know is that when she realized who it was and what he wanted, she was afraid. What we know is that she said no. She said she did not want to go with him. She said she had plans. She said, in every way a person can say such a thing, that she did not want him in her life. The response to her rejection came quickly, the rage that had been building up inside him, the rage that came from his fantasy being rejected by reality, the rage that came from a woman refusing to be the person he had constructed in his mind, the rage that came from his desire being thwarted. All of it erupted. In that moment, something shifted. In that moment, the line between thinking about something and doing something was crossed. He took her. He forced her into a vehicle. He took her to a location that he had chosen, a place where he knew he would not be interrupted. Maybe he had already scouted this location. Maybe he had already thought about this in his fantasies. He had taken her to a place where he could do what he wanted without fear of being discovered. He forced her to engage in sexual assault. He hurt her in ways that are difficult to describe, ways that violated her in the most fundamental sense a human being can be violated. He assaulted her. He robbed her of her dignity. He robbed her of her choice. He robbed her of her body. And in the end, he killed her. The method of her death has never been fully made public, and there are good reasons for keeping such details from the public. We do not need to know the exact mechanics of her death. We do not need to know the specific ways that she suffered. What we know is that she died in fear and in agony. What we know is that in her final moments, she understood that her life was ending, and that she could do nothing to stop it. What we know is that she died at the hands of someone she had known, someone she had been kind to, someone who had repaid her kindness with the ultimate betrayal. After her death, David made a decision about what to do with her body. This is one of the things that separates a person who commits a crime of passion from a person who commits a calculated crime. A person who acts in passion might feel remorse immediately. A person who commits a calculated crime often continues to think clearly about how to avoid detection. David took her to a location far from where he had murdered her. He left her in a place where he believed she would not be found, or where her discovery would take a very long time. He took great care to conceal what he had done. He wanted to cover his tracks. He wanted to make it seem like she had simply disappeared. Maybe he thought that without a body, without clear evidence of what had happened, he would never be caught. He took her somewhere secluded. He left her in a place where she would not be easily found. He took steps to try to ensure that his actions would not be discovered. He went home. He cleaned himself. He changed his clothes. He put the clothes he had been wearing into a bag, and he disposed of them in a way he believed would prevent them from being found. He destroyed evidence. He tried to erase the physical evidence of what he had done. He went to work the next day. He went about his life as though nothing had happened. He went about his job. He went home. He went about his normal routines. He lived his life, continued his work, maintained his relationships, and carried his secret forward through the years. This is the part of the story that many people find impossible to understand. How can someone do something so horrific and then continue on with their life? How can someone experience the reality of what they have done and not fall apart? How can someone live with such a terrible secret? The answer is that not all people experience guilt the same way. Not all people have the same capacity for remorse, and not all people are broken by their own actions in the same manner. Some people are able to compartmentalize. Some people are able to push the memory away. Some people are able to tell themselves stories that allow them to live with what they have done. Some people, it seems, are simply able to suppress it and move on. The investigation into Rachel's disappearance began immediately. It did not begin hours later or days later. It began immediately when it became clear that she was not going to arrive at the dinner where her friends were waiting for her. Her friends became worried when she did not arrive at the restaurant for dinner. They called her apartment. They called her parents. They called the police. Within hours, police were searching for her. They did not wait for the standard 24 hours that has become part of popular culture around missing persons. They understood that in cases involving women who disappear under suspicious circumstances, the first hours are critical. They took the case seriously from the beginning. They interviewed her friends, her family, her co-workers. They tried to determine if there had been any conflict in her life, any relationship that had become problematic, any situation that might have caused her to disappear voluntarily. They looked for signs that she had been struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts. They looked for signs that she had been unhappy with her life. They found nothing. By all accounts, Rachel had been happy. She was not running away from anything. She was not depressed or suicidal or struggling with anything that would have caused her to leave her life behind. The police began to suspect that something bad had happened to her. They began to suspect that she had not disappeared of her own volition. They began to search for her. They searched the areas near where she lived. They searched the areas near her school. They searched the locations that she frequented. They dragged rivers and lakes and ponds. They brought in trained dogs that could detect the scent of human remains. They organized volunteer search parties. They released her photograph to the media. They asked the public for information. They made appeals for tips. They kept her case in the public eye. Days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of Rachel. Weeks turned into months, and still nothing. The search efforts continued, but they began to slow down. Volunteers could not maintain the same level of energy and commitment. Police resources had to be diverted to other cases. The media stopped covering the story as intensely. Rachel's disappearance went from being front-page news to being something that people mentioned in passing. The detective Robert became more and more convinced that this was not a disappearance, but a murder. He believed that someone had taken Rachel and killed her. He believed that the person who had done this was someone Rachel knew. This belief was based on his experience, and on his intuition, and on the patterns he had studied in similar cases. When women disappear and are found dead, they are most likely killed by someone they know, someone who had access to them, someone who had opportunity. He believed this with certainty. He began to investigate people who knew Rachel. He conducted interviews. He asked questions about relationships and conflicts and circumstances. One person of interest was a man named David, who had some connection to Rachel through work. They had seen each other. There were people who could put them in the same place. There was a possible connection. Robert investigated David, but when the police questioned David, he had an alibi. There was someone who said he was with David at the time when Rachel disappeared. The alibi held up under scrutiny. Without physical evidence, without a confession, without witnesses who could place David at the scene of the crime, the case could not move forward against him. The case was circumstantial. Everything was circumstantial. There was the possible connection, but there was no proof. There was no DNA evidence in 1992 that could prove it. There was no biological evidence that clearly pointed to David. There was suspicion, but suspicion is not enough to convict someone, or even to charge someone with a crime. Other suspects were investigated. Other theories were pursued. Police looked at Rachel's boyfriend Michael, thinking perhaps there had been a crime of passion, thinking perhaps something had happened in their relationship that had caused him to hurt her. But Michael's grief seemed genuine. Michael's love for Rachel seemed genuine. Michael had not wanted to hurt her. Michael had wanted to marry her. Michael had not wanted to lose her. The evidence did not point to Michael. Other men in Rachel's life were investigated. Other possibilities were considered. But nothing seemed to lead anywhere. The evidence was circumstantial. The witnesses were unclear. The timeline had gaps that made it impossible to prove what had happened with certainty. There was no clear evidence of a crime. There was no body. There was no crime scene that had been clearly identified. There were no witnesses who had seen the crime happen. There were only questions and theories and possibilities. Months turned into years. Rachel's case became a cold case. It was filed away with all the other cases that had not been solved, that did not have clear answers, that remained mysteries. Rachel became one of many missing people, one of many unsolved cases, one of many names on a file somewhere. But Rachel's family never stopped looking for answers. Rachel's mother, who we'll call Patricia, became obsessed with finding out what had happened to her daughter. She kept Rachel's case in the media. She gave interviews. She put up posters. She organized fundraisers to hire private investigators. She refused to let people forget about Rachel. She refused to let her daughter become just another cold case. She kept fighting. She kept pushing. She kept searching. This kind of work, this kind of obsession with truth and justice, exacts an enormous toll on a person. Patricia aged decades in the years after Rachel disappeared. She developed health problems. She struggled with depression and anxiety, and the kind of trauma that comes from never being able to close a chapter of your life. She struggled with the not knowing. She struggled with the uncertainty. She struggled with the questions that had no answers. But she did not stop. She continued to push for answers. She continued to believe that eventually, somehow, the truth would come out. Robert continued to pull the file on Rachel's case, periodically throughout his career. He would review it. He would look for any detail that he might have missed. He would consider new theories and new possibilities. He held on to the belief that David was responsible, even though the evidence did not support such a conclusion at the time. He believed it because of his instincts, because of patterns he had observed, because of something in the investigation that never felt right to him. He could not let it go. Other detectives thought he was wasting his time. Other detectives told him to let it go, to move on to cases that could be solved, to focus his energy on investigations that had a chance of success. But Robert could not let it go. He had made a commitment to Rachel, even though he would never meet her, that he would not abandon her case. He had made a commitment that he would keep searching for the truth, no matter how long it took. Years passed. Robert continued his career. He worked on other cases. He solved some of them. He failed to solve some of them. But Rachel's case never left his mind. It was always there, in the back of his mind, a mystery that demanded to be solved. Robert was not the kind of detective who accepted unsolved cases as inevitable. Robert was the kind of detective who believed that every case could be solved, that every victim deserved justice, that every mystery had an answer, if you looked hard enough and believed hard enough. In the year 2024, technology had advanced in ways that no one could have predicted in 1992. DNA technology had become incredibly sophisticated. The science of forensic genetics had evolved in ways that seemed almost like science fiction. The ability to extract genetic information from tiny, degraded samples of biological material had become possible in ways that had not existed in the past. DNA could be extracted from hair shafts without the root bulb. DNA could be extracted from skin cells. DNA could be recovered from evidence that had been stored for decades. The sensitivity of DNA testing had improved dramatically. What once required a large sample of fresh blood could now be accomplished with microscopic amounts of material. Investigators decided to re-examine evidence from Rachel's case using these new technologies. Evidence that had been collected at the scene of the crime, evidence that had never yielded results with the older forensic techniques, was analyzed again using modern methods. The evidence had been preserved carefully over the decades. Even though the case had gone cold, the evidence had not been destroyed. The physical evidence from Rachel's case had been stored in an evidence locker, waiting for the day when technology might catch up to the question of who had committed the crime. That day had finally arrived. The evidence was analyzed, samples were tested, DNA was extracted. The results came back, and they pointed to someone. The DNA matched a person who had been in the system, a person whose genetic profile was on file for other reasons. That person was David. The alibi that had protected David in 1992 was no longer sufficient. DNA evidence is objective. DNA evidence does not rely on the memory of a person. DNA evidence does not change based on time or pressure, or the stories people tell to protect themselves. DNA evidence is what it is. David was arrested. The moment came, 32 years after Rachel's disappearance. A man who had believed he had successfully escaped the consequences of his actions was suddenly confronted with the reality that he had not. That his actions had not been forgotten. That the truth, even after 3 decades, had a way of emerging into the light. That the night he had taken Rachel, the night he had killed her, the night he had hidden her body, that night had left evidence that could eventually be recovered. That night had left a trace on his body, a microscopic trace, DNA that he could not have known about, DNA that had transferred to him during his assault on Rachel, DNA that had remained with him even after all these years, or DNA that had been collected as evidence at the time and preserved for future technology to detect. When David learned that he had been arrested based on DNA evidence, something shifted inside of him. Perhaps he realized that the game was finally over. Perhaps he understood that there was no way to escape anymore. Perhaps he understood that the only question now was whether he would continue to deny it, or whether he would finally tell the truth. Perhaps he decided that after all these years, he was tired of carrying the secret. He was tired of living a lie. He was tired of the guilt that he had been suppressing for 32 years. Perhaps the thought that he could finally be honest, that he could finally tell the truth about what he had done, was somehow a relief. Perhaps confession, after 3 decades of silence, felt like freedom. David confessed. He confessed to killing Rachel. He confessed to the sexual assault. He confessed to the specific details of what he had done to her. He told the police where Rachel's body was located. He provided information that could only have come from someone who had been there, who had committed the crime. He described the location. He described what had happened. He described the circumstances. He provided details that confirmed that he was telling the truth, that he was not making things up, that he actually knew where she was and what had happened to her. And in his confession, he provided context. He explained his obsession with Rachel. He described the fantasies he had carried in his mind. He explained the rejection he had experienced when Rachel had refused his advances. He described the rage that had consumed him in that moment. He described the decision to kill her and the process of disposing of her body. He described the years he had lived knowing what he had done, knowing that he was a murderer, knowing that he had destroyed a family and altered the course of many lives. Rachel's remains were recovered from the location David had indicated. Finally, after 32 years, Patricia and Rachel's father had closure in one sense. They knew what had happened to their daughter. They knew who had done it. They could finally lay her to rest. They could finally have a funeral, where they could say goodbye, where they could acknowledge her death rather than living in the limbo of not knowing. They could see her one more time, even though it would not be the way they wanted to see her. They could say goodbye. They could mourn. They could begin the long process of healing. But closure is a complicated thing. Closure does not undo what was done. Closure does not bring someone back to life. Closure does not heal all the wounds that have been created by a terrible crime. What closure does provide is an end to uncertainty. What closure does provide is the ability to move forward with some sense of understanding, even if that understanding is painful. But there is another part of this story that makes it more than just a standard case of murder and justice. There is another part that raises profound questions about human nature and conscience, and the capacity of people to be haunted by their own actions. There is the matter of David's return to the crime scene. Years after his conviction, while David was incarcerated, something happened. David became eligible for supervised release under certain conditions. This might have been related to rehabilitation programs, or psychological counseling, or court-ordered visits as part of his treatment. He was transported, under guard, to the location where he had committed the crime. The specific reasons for this transport are complicated and involve legal processes and rehabilitation protocols that are sometimes used in the criminal justice system. On that day in March, more than 30 years after he had taken Rachel's life, David stood at the location where everything had changed. And something happened in that moment that would change how Detective Robert understood the nature of guilt and conscience, and the human capacity to carry the weight of terrible actions. David stood at the location, and he wept. He stood there for several minutes, and he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. He allowed himself to confront the reality of his actions in a way that he perhaps had not done in the 32 years between the crime and his arrest. He allowed himself to truly understand what he had done, what he had taken from the world, what he had destroyed. He stood at the location where a woman's life had ended, and he acknowledged what he had done. This moment, captured on security footage, would become the center of a larger conversation about remorse and justice, and the question of whether a person who has committed a terrible crime can ever truly atone for what they have done. When Detective Robert learned about this moment, when he watched the footage of David standing at the crime scene and confronting his own guilt, Robert's understanding of the case deepened. He realized that the years of obsession, the years of refusing to let the case go, the years of believing in David's guilt even when the evidence was not there, had been vindicated. But more than that, Robert understood something about the nature of conscience. He understood that even a person who had successfully hidden their crime for 3 decades could not entirely escape the weight of what they had done. He understood that the human mind carries things that cannot be put down, that some memories cannot be forgotten, that some actions cannot be escaped from, no matter how much time passes. He understood that guilt, even when it is suppressed and hidden, even when it is buried deep inside a person, continues to exist. It continues to exert its force. It eventually demands to be acknowledged. This case raises profound questions about justice and mercy and the nature of accountability. It raises questions about what closure truly means and whether closure is even possible when a life has been taken. It raises questions about the human capacity for carrying guilt and the circumstances under which that guilt finally becomes unbearable. One of the most challenging questions this case presents is whether David's eventual confession and his moment of confrontation at the crime scene represent redemption, or whether they represent something else entirely. Is there redemption for someone who has committed murder? Can a person atone for such an action? Or does the taking of a life create a debt that can never be repaid, a harm that can never be undone? These are not simple questions with simple answers. Different people, different belief systems, different moral frameworks would answer them differently. Patricia, Rachel's mother, was asked in interviews whether she had forgiven David. Her answer was thoughtful and complicated. She said that she did not know if forgiveness was even possible for something so terrible. She said that understanding David's remorse did not change the fact that her daughter was dead, that her daughter's future had been stolen, that the family had lost something that could never be recovered. But she also acknowledged that David's remorse seemed genuine. She acknowledged that the guilt he carried seemed to be authentic, and that he had spent his life in prison, thinking about what he had done to Rachel. She expressed some measure of compassion for David, not because what he did was forgivable, but because she understood that he, too, had become a kind of prisoner to his own actions, even before he was locked away by law enforcement. Robert retired from the police force several years after David's conviction. He said in interviews that the Rachel case had taught him that persistence matters, that belief in the truth matters, and that refusing to give up on the people you are trying to help matters. He said that the case had also taught him that mysteries often do have answers, but sometimes the answer comes only after a very long time. He said that the waiting, the uncertainty, The years of following dead ends and pursuing theories that did not work out were all part of the process of finally arriving at the truth. He said that if he had given up, if he had accepted that some cases are simply unsolved, if he had let Rachel's case fade into the background, then the truth might have never come out. He said that justice sometimes requires waiting, requires patience, requires someone to keep fighting even when there is no hope, requires someone to keep believing even when nobody else believes anymore. The story of Rachel and David and Detective Robert is, in the end, a story about truth. It is a story about how truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, has a way of making itself known. It is a story about the power of persistence and belief, and the refusal to accept injustice as an acceptable outcome. It is a story that reminds us that the people who disappear, who are taken from us, who become cold case statistics on police department files, deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have someone continue to believe in their story. They deserve to have someone continue to search for the truth about what happened to them. Rachel Marie deserved better than she received. She deserved a life that continued beyond 34 years. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to see her dreams come true. She deserved to be a mother if she wanted to be. She deserved to teach for decades. She deserved to make a difference in countless students' lives. She deserved to travel and experience and live. She did not receive those things, but she did receive something else. She received someone who would not forget about her, someone who would not let her case disappear into history, someone who would continue to search for answers until those answers were finally found. She received justice, delayed as it was, but justice nonetheless. And in the end, that is what every victim deserves.